In the heart of Houston, Texas, nestled in a tight-knit community where faith and family were the bedrock of daily life, Pastor Mark Davis was a man revered by all who knew him. His voice, rich with conviction, could stir the hearts of anyone who listened. His congregation saw him as a leader, a guide through the toughest times. Mark had the ability to uplift and inspire, a man whose sermons touched the soul and whose integrity stood as a shining example to his flock. To the world outside, Mark's life was an open book, one that seemed to be written in perfection. He had a beautiful wife, a loving daughter, and a community that held him in high esteem. Mark was the very embodiment of what a man of God should be, steadfast in his beliefs, devoted to his family, and always putting others before himself. His public persona was flawless. He was a father figure, a trusted friend, and a man whose actions were always above reproach. His family life mirrored the values he preached every Sunday: love, respect, faith, and devotion. But as the sun set each evening over their picturesque neighborhood, behind closed doors, a far darker story was unfolding. The life Mark had carefully crafted was beginning to show cracks, ones that no one, not even his closest congregation members, could see. Beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family lurked a truth that would tear apart everything Mark had worked for. A secret so sinister that when it was finally exposed, it would send shockwaves through the community and forever stain the reputation of the man they once called the perfect pastor. At the heart of this story was his 16-year-old daughter, Emily, a girl whose radiant smile and boundless ambition could brighten any room she entered. Emily had everything ahead of her: youth, potential, and a future that seemed limitless. She was driven, intelligent, and compassionate. To her father, Emily was more than just a daughter. She was the embodiment of everything he cherished. Her success was his pride, her dreams his hopes for the future. But little did anyone know, the very person who should have protected Emily, the man she trusted above all others, was hiding a monstrous secret. A secret so grotesque that it would ultimately lead to the unimaginable, the murder of his own daughter. And all of it to conceal the sordid affair he was having with her best friend. What no one could have predicted was that the perfect pastor, the man who stood before his congregation every Sunday, preaching about love, forgiveness, and family values, was the same man who was capable of taking the life of his own flesh and blood to protect his twisted desires. This is the chilling story of betrayal, manipulation, and the brutal lengths a man would go to keep his darkest secrets buried. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Your support means the world to us, and we truly appreciate it. Thank you. From the outside looking in, the Davis family had it all. Pastor Mark Davis, a well-respected leader in his church, seemed to have built a life that anyone would envy. His wife, Rebecca, stood by him as the supportive, ever-gracious partner, her quiet strength complementing his more commanding presence. Together, they presented the image of a couple deeply in love, a partnership rooted in faith and mutual respect. Their daughter, Emily, was the golden child, an academically gifted, socially charismatic 16-year-old who seemed destined for greatness. Their home in suburban Houston, with its well-kept lawn and white picket fence, was more than just a house. It was a symbol. A symbol of stability, of family, of the values that the community held dear. It was a place where neighbors gathered for barbecues, where the doors were always open for a warm meal, and where laughter echoed through the halls every Sunday after church. The kind of place where parents could rest easy knowing their children were safe, loved, and growing up in a wholesome environment. Pastor Mark's sermons were a reflection of this life. Week after week, he stood at the pulpit, delivering messages that resonated with his congregation. His words were filled with wisdom, grace, and a sense of moral clarity that people clung to in uncertain times. He had a unique ability to make the scripture feel alive, offering comfort, hope, and direction to those in need. To his followers, he was not just a pastor, he was a symbol of strength, of unwavering faith, a man who had it all together, a man to be admired, looked up to, and trusted. Emily, their only daughter, had always been at the center of their world. She was the embodiment of everything they had hoped for in a child. Intelligent beyond her years, with an ambition that pushed her to excel in every area of her life. Emily was a star student, a leader among her peers. Her smile could light up any room, and her kindness made her a natural friend to everyone she met. Emily had big dreams. She wanted to go to college, to change the world, and to make her mark in a way that would make her parents proud. Her best friend, Sarah, was a constant presence in her life. The two had been inseparable since they were children, their bond forged in the innocence of shared childhood memories. From sleepovers to school projects, from their first crushes to their biggest fears, they had always been there for each other. Theirs was a friendship built on trust, loyalty, and an unspoken understanding that they would always have each other's backs. To the outside world, the Davis family seemed like the epitome of the American dream, a strong, loving family deeply rooted in faith, respected by their peers, and admired by all. They were a shining example of what a family should be, the kind of family everyone aspired to have. But behind the closed doors of their home, beneath the smiles and the carefully crafted appearances, things were beginning to change. Small cracks started to form in the flawless image of the Davis family. The cracks were subtle at first, small moments, seemingly insignificant, that no one else would have noticed. Emily, once filled with energy and optimism, began to withdraw. She wasn't her usual self. Her bright eyes seemed duller, her laughter quieter. Her father's mood was becoming erratic, snapping at her or her mother for no apparent reason, his temper flaring in moments that should have been calm. At first, Emily brushed it off as stress or maybe the pressures of life. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Emily started noticing little things that unsettled her. Her father's phone always face down when Sarah was around, the way he seemed overly concerned with Sarah's well-being, the private conversations that stopped the moment Emily entered the room. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that her father was becoming someone else, a stranger in her own home. She wanted to ignore it, to convince herself that she was just imagining things, but the feeling grew stronger with each passing day. As Emily began to sense the shifting dynamics in her home, she struggled to make sense of it all. What was happening to the man she had always looked up to, trusted, and loved? And why did her best friend, the person she trusted most in the world, seem so distant, so evasive? Emily had always thought their family was invincible, that they could weather any storm together. But now, a storm was brewing in the very heart of her home, and Emily was the only one who could see it. What was it that her father was hiding? And how far would he go to protect his secret? The questions that gnawed at Emily's mind were only the beginning. A dark truth was waiting to be uncovered, one that would tear her world apart, and shatter the image of the perfect family that had once seemed unbreakable. For as long as Emily could remember, her father had been her rock, steady, wise, and unshakably calm. Pastor Mark Davis was the type of man who exuded confidence and grace, a figure that others turned to in times of trouble. He had a way of speaking that made people feel understood, comforted, and guided. Emily had always admired him, not just as a father, but as a man of deep integrity and unwavering faith. To her, he was the embodiment of everything good, someone who stood tall in a world that often felt uncertain, a man who could weather any storm. But lately, something had shifted. It was subtle at first, just a strange tension in the air that Emily couldn't quite explain. There were moments when her father would snap, not just at her, but at her mother too. A harsh word here, an impatient tone there. For someone who had always been the picture of calm, it was unsettling to see him react so sharply. It wasn't like him, and Emily couldn't figure out why it was happening. One evening, after a simple dinner conversation about their day, Pastor Mark's patience seemed to unravel entirely. Emily had asked him a harmless question about an upcoming church event, but his response was cold, curt, even defensive. He had never reacted that way to her before, certainly not with the icy detachment he now displayed. His face, usually warm and inviting, now seemed hardened, closed off. It was as if a mask had slipped over his once open demeanor, leaving Emily to question what had happened to the father she thought she knew so well. At first, Emily chalked it up to stress. Maybe he was overwhelmed with church duties, or maybe something else was on his mind. But as the days passed, the changes became impossible to ignore. His temper flared more often. Small, insignificant things would set him off. The man who had taught her the value of patience and forgiveness now seemed consumed by a restless anger that she couldn't understand. Was it the pressures of being a pastor? Was it something personal? The more Emily thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just stress, it was something deeper, something darker. Meanwhile, Sarah, Emily's best friend, began to notice the changes in her too. Emily, once the life of the group, the girl who couldn't help but laugh, now seemed to be a shell of herself. Her vibrant energy was fading, and her once constant smile had turned into a distant, forced expression. Emily had always been the girl who made everything look easy, her grades, her friendships, even her family life. But now, she seemed weighed down by something invisible, something she refused to talk about. Sarah had known Emily for years, and over that time, they'd become like sisters. They had shared everything, their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. Sarah had always admired how Emily could light up a room, how her confidence and optimism were infectious. But now, something had changed. Emily was quieter, more withdrawn, like she was carrying a heavy burden that she wasn't willing to share. Sarah tried to reach out, to offer a listening ear, but each time she did, Emily pushed her away with vague excuses. "I'm just stressed, Sarah," or "I'm fine, really." But Sarah wasn't convinced. The Emily she knew didn't brush off her concerns with empty reassurances. The more Sarah observed, the more she realized that Emily wasn't just going through a tough time. This was something different, something that couldn't be explained away by stress or tiredness. Emily was hiding something, and it wasn't just a bad day. There were cracks in her best friend's perfect smile, and Sarah knew it. She could feel the distance growing between them, the invisible wall that Emily had started to build around herself. And then, there were the moments when Emily's eyes would drift away mid-conversation, lost in thought, as if her mind were a million miles away. When they hung out, it felt like she wasn't really there, like she was physically present but emotionally distant. It was in those quiet moments that Sarah started to feel the weight of the change. She had no idea what was going on, but deep down, she feared it was something much worse than Emily was letting on. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the turmoil Emily was facing had something to do with her father, Mark Davis, the man who had always been their steady rock, the one who had guided them through their toughest moments. What was happening to him? And more importantly, what was happening to his family? As Sarah watched the unraveling of her best friend, her worry grew. She wanted to help, but Emily wasn't letting her in. Emily's quiet pain, her refusal to talk, left Sarah feeling helpless, unsure of how to break through the growing silence that surrounded her. What was Emily so afraid to say? And what was Mark hiding from everyone, including his daughter and the congregation that trusted him? The answer was out there, somewhere, hidden beneath the surface of their perfect life. But the question was, how far would the Davis family go to protect the truth from being exposed? And how long would it take before Emily, Sarah, and even Mark himself were unable to keep the lies from spilling into the open? The tension in the air was thickening, and for Emily, Sarah, and Mark, the worst was yet to come. What Emily couldn't have known, what no one could have guessed, was that Sarah, her best friend, the girl she trusted, and it wasn't just a bad day. There were cracks in her best friend's perfect smile, and Sarah knew it. She could feel the distance growing between them, the invisible wall that Emily had started to build around herself. And then, there were the moments when Emily's eyes would drift away mid-conversation, lost in thought, as if her mind were a million miles away. When they hung out, it felt like she wasn't really there, like she was physically present but emotionally distant. It was in those quiet moments that Sarah started to feel the weight of the change. She had no idea what was going on, but deep down, she feared it was something much worse than Emily was letting on. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the turmoil Emily was facing had something to do with her father, Mark Davis, the man who had always been their steady rock, the one who had guided them through their toughest moments. What was happening to him? And more importantly, what was happening to his family? As Sarah watched the unraveling of her best friend, her worry grew. She wanted to help, but Emily wasn't letting her in. Emily's quiet pain, her refusal to talk, left Sarah feeling helpless, unsure of how to break through the growing silence that surrounded her. What was Emily so afraid to say? And what was Mark hiding from everyone, including his daughter and the congregation that trusted him? The answer was out there, somewhere, hidden beneath the surface of their perfect life. But the question was, how far would the Davis family go to protect the truth from being exposed? And how long would it take before Emily, Sarah, and even Mark himself were unable to keep the lies from spilling into the open? The tension in the air was thickening, and for Emily, Sarah, and Mark, the worst was yet to come. What Emily couldn't have known, what no one could have guessed, was that Sarah, her best friend, the girl she trusted most, had become the unwitting target of her father's increasingly inappropriate attention. Pastor Mark Davis, a man of power, influence, and deep religious conviction, had begun to blur the lines between a mentor and something far darker, something that no one could have anticipated. At first, Pastor Mark's attention towards Sarah seemed harmless enough. He was, after all, a man of the church, a mentor to many young people in the congregation, and Sarah was a bright, ambitious girl he admired. When he praised her for her hard work at school or encouraged her to pursue her dreams, it felt like a kind, fatherly gesture, something any well-meaning adult might offer to a young person with potential. His words were warm, his encouragement genuine on the surface. Sarah felt flattered by his attention. After all, he was a respected leader in their community, a man who could provide guidance and support. But over time, the attention began to shift. The compliments, which had once seemed innocent, slowly morphed into something more personal. The way he looked at her, the way his gaze lingered just a little too long, started to make Sarah feel uncomfortable. His compliments became more intimate, no longer about her potential or her grades, but about her appearance, her smile, the way she carried herself. What once seemed like admiration had turned into something more insidious, something Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on but knew, deep down, wasn't right. It wasn't just the words. Pastor Mark's physical gestures began to change as well. A casual hand on her shoulder that lingered too long. A touch on her back as he passed her in the church hallway. Each time, Sarah's discomfort grew. She didn't know how to process what was happening. On one hand, Mark had always been like a father figure to her, a trusted adult she had looked up to for years. But now, as his touches became more frequent, more suggestive, the boundary between fatherly affection and something much darker began to disappear. There were private messages, too, texts late at night, under the guise of checking in or offering guidance. At first, they seemed harmless. "I believe in you, Sarah. You're going to go far." But as the messages continued, they started to feel different. They were too personal, too intimate. "I'm so proud of you," one read. "You make me so happy, Sarah. I don't know what I would do without you." These messages, though still carefully worded, felt like they crossed a line. But what could she say? What could she do? Pastor Mark was a man of influence, a pillar in the community, and Sarah felt trapped in his web of control. She admired him, yes, but she was also deeply confused. Was this behavior just a part of his mentorship? Or was something else at play? As the months went by, Sarah felt herself growing more and more uncomfortable in his presence. But when she tried to talk to anyone about it, there was always a part of her that hesitated. Pastor Mark had such a strong reputation. Everyone in the church loved him. No one would believe her if she told them what was happening. What would they think of her? Could she even trust her own feelings? Or was she overreacting? It didn't help that she was often alone with him. He found excuses to spend more time with her, offering rides home after church, asking for her help with small tasks, suggesting they meet privately to discuss her future. The more time they spent together, the more Sarah felt the uncomfortable tension between them grow. His smiles, once warm and friendly, now carried an undertone of something she couldn't define but instinctively knew wasn't right. She tried to brush it off, telling herself she was imagining things, but every interaction with him made her more certain that something was off. For Sarah, the situation had become a nightmare she didn't know how to wake up from. Every time Mark touched her, praised her, or looked at her in a certain way, she felt her stomach twist with unease. She longed for the days when their interactions were simple and kind. She longed for the days when Mark was just the trusted pastor of the church, a father figure who wanted the best for his congregation. But now, those lines had blurred beyond recognition, and Sarah was left questioning everything she had once known about him. And yet, as much as Sarah tried to ignore the signs, the unease began to grow. The more intimate his gestures became, the more Sarah's instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. But how could she confront him? How could she, a young girl trying to navigate the complexities of adolescence, stand up to a man so powerful, so revered in their community? She felt like she was walking a tightrope, unsure of where to turn or who to trust. All the while, Emily remained oblivious to what was happening under her very nose. She had no idea that her father, her once steadfast, loving father, was the source of Sarah's discomfort. Sarah, trapped in a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and fear, didn't know how to voice what she was feeling. The lines between right and wrong had become so blurred that even she wasn't sure where the truth ended and the manipulation began. In the days to come, the tension between the three of them, Emily, Sarah, and Pastor Mark, would only grow. The secrets that had been building slowly would soon come crashing to the surface, unraveling everything in their wake. The question now wasn't if the truth would come out, but when, and how much it would cost everyone involved. Emily had always trusted her father. He had been her protector, her guide, the man she looked up to. But recently, as the atmosphere at home grew tense, something started to feel off. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's attention had shifted away from her and towards Sarah. It wasn't overt at first, just small things, extra compliments, unsolicited advice given to Sarah that Emily didn't receive. His gaze lingered a little too long when Sarah was around, and his tone had changed from warm and fatherly to something more personal, more invested. Emily, once the apple of her father's eye, now felt like a bystander in her own home. She had always shared everything with Sarah, but now, Emily couldn't help but notice the distance growing between them. Her father's interest in Sarah made her feel pushed aside. She was no longer the center of his world. His focus seemed entirely on her best friend, and it hurt. Then, one afternoon, Emily's suspicions were confirmed in the most painful way. As she was helping Sarah search for something on her phone, Emily's fingers accidentally brushed over an open text message from Mark. The message seemed innocent at first, but as she read on, her stomach churned. The tone of the messages was too familiar, too intimate. "I'm so proud of you," one text read, followed by, "I think about you more than you know." The words made her skin crawl, and the more she scrolled, the more the weight of the betrayal sank in. Emily's heart raced as she processed what she was reading. The man she had trusted, her father, was crossing a line that no parent should ever cross. She confronted Sarah immediately, her voice trembling with hurt and disbelief. But Sarah, her best friend, denied everything. She insisted that it was nothing, that Emily was overreacting. But as Emily looked into Sarah's eyes, she saw the fear, the guilt. It was all there, hidden beneath her words. The bond that had once been unbreakable between Emily and Sarah began to unravel in that moment. The trust they had shared for so many years shattered, replaced by a cold, painful reality. Emily felt more alone than ever, her entire world turned upside down by the betrayal of both the man she had called father and the friend she had trusted most. Emily could no longer ignore the truth. She confronted her father, demanding answers. Mark, caught off guard, tried to deny everything, to explain away the texts and the strange behavior. He begged Emily to remain silent for the sake of the family, to protect the perfect image they had built. But Emily wasn't buying it. She refused to be manipulated, refused to stay silent. The confrontation quickly escalated, and Mark's calm demeanor began to crack. He pleaded with Emily to keep quiet, to think about the consequences. But Emily was steadfast. She had uncovered the truth, and she wasn't about to let it go. But what Emily didn't know was just how far her father was willing to go to protect his secret. That night, when the house was still and quiet, Mark and Emily found themselves alone. Rebecca had gone out, leaving father and daughter in a tense silence that had been growing between them. Emily, her mind racing with everything she had learned, had hoped for some kind of reconciliation, a moment where she could confront her father and make sense of the nightmare she had uncovered. But what she couldn't have predicted was how far Mark was willing to go to protect his carefully constructed life. In a moment of blind desperation, Mark crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. His carefully built world, his reputation as the moral leader, the trusted father, was on the brink of falling apart. The weight of his lies, his affair, and the looming threat of Emily's silence breaking his facade finally pushed him past the point of no return. As Emily confronted him, demanding the truth, something snapped inside of him. With an overwhelming surge of fear and rage, Mark attacked his daughter, silencing her forever. The once vibrant room, filled with the sound of Emily's laughter, now became the scene of an unimaginable act. Emily's dreams, her future, everything that had once seemed possible for her, were stolen in an instant. Mark stood over her, breathing heavily, his mind reeling with the enormity of what he had just done. But he didn't stop there. The man who had once preached about truth, justice, and righteousness now set about covering up his crime, knowing full well the consequences of his actions. Mark staged the scene with chilling precision, making it appear as though a violent break-in had occurred. He shattered a window, scattering items across the floor, and overturned furniture to simulate a struggle. Everything was meticulously placed to divert suspicion. Then, he did what he had to do to complete the illusion. He called 911. His voice cracked as he pretended to be the grief-stricken father, reporting the tragic discovery of his daughter's death. He spoke of finding her in the midst of a violent robbery, trying to evoke sympathy from the operator. But his words were hollow, his distress feigned, a desperate attempt to maintain the image of the devoted father he had once been. As the authorities arrived at the scene, Mark played his part flawlessly, his grief seemingly genuine. He pointed to the broken window, the disarray in the room, and the signs of struggle, all the while keeping his darkest secret hidden from the world. The man who had once been a beacon of integrity was now nothing more than a murderer, willing to sacrifice everything to protect his lies. But no matter how carefully he had orchestrated the scene, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface. And the darkness that Mark had so desperately tried to bury was far from over. When law enforcement arrived at the Davis household, everything seemed to fall into place. The broken window, the overturned furniture, the signs of a struggle, it all painted the picture of a violent burglary gone horribly wrong. Mark, ever the devoted father, was quick to point to the evidence, detailing the supposed robbery and the discovery of Emily's lifeless body. His performance was convincing, his grief palpable. He was the grieving father, shocked and devastated by the loss of his daughter. To the first responders and the community, it seemed like an open and shut case. But the detectives, trained to look beyond the surface, quickly began to notice discrepancies in Mark's story. As they started to investigate further, they found that the timeline Mark had given didn't add up. The sequence of events he described didn't fit with the evidence at the scene. The broken glass from the window, for example, had been piled outside the room, something that was inconsistent with a break-in. In a genuine struggle, the glass would have been scattered inside. Moreover, there was a lack of fingerprints from anyone but Mark, which was a red flag. The detectives dug deeper, speaking to neighbors, gathering more information, and reviewing the crime scene with a meticulous eye. Slowly, the carefully constructed narrative Mark had woven began to unravel. The more they uncovered, the more they realized this was not a random act of violence. It was something far more calculated, and the father who stood before them was not the innocent man he appeared to be. The breakthrough came when they brought Sarah in for questioning. Still reeling from the shock of losing her best friend, Sarah was distraught, her emotions raw. But as the detectives pressed her, they sensed something wasn't quite right. Sarah had always been close to Emily, and yet she seemed distant, almost guarded when asked about the events leading up to Emily's death. At first, Sarah denied anything unusual had occurred between her and Mark. She insisted that he had always been like a father figure to her, that there was nothing out of the ordinary in their relationship. but the detectives weren't convinced. They could tell Sarah was holding something back, and the pressure mounted. After hours of questioning, the facade finally began to crack. With a tremor in her voice, Sarah confessed to the affair. She revealed how Mark had manipulated her, how he had blurred the lines between mentorship and something far more sinister. She spoke of how his gestures, once seemingly innocent, had slowly crossed into uncomfortable territory. How his praise for her began to take on a personal tone, how the compliments became laced with an intimacy she hadn't asked for. She described the way he had used his position of power to control her, to make her feel special, until it became almost impossible to resist. The confession rocked the detectives to their core. Sarah's words painted a horrifying picture of manipulation, deceit, and betrayal. Mark had not only shattered his daughter's trust but had exploited Sarah's vulnerability for his own selfish desires. The line between fatherly affection and something far darker had been crossed in ways no one had imagined. Sarah's confession was the final piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't enough to secure a conviction. The detectives knew they needed more, hard evidence, something that would tie Mark directly to the crime. And so, they continued to dig, determined to uncover the truth that Mark had tried so desperately to hide. The trial that followed was a spectacle. Mark, once the beloved pastor of his community, now sat in the defendant's chair, facing charges of murder, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. The prosecution laid out the damning evidence: text messages, forensic analysis, the staged crime scene. The truth could no longer be hidden. Grace, Emily's mother, took the stand, describing the unimaginable loss of her daughter and the painful realization that her husband was responsible. Sarah's testimony was equally heart-wrenching, as she described how she had been manipulated by Mark. In the end, Mark was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The community that had once revered him was now left in shock, struggling to reconcile the man they had trusted with the monster he had become. The story of Emily Davis and the destruction of her family serves as a tragic reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the devastating consequences of betrayal. For those who loved her, the trial brought a sense of closure, but it could never undo the loss they had suffered. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more true crime stories that need to be told. Let us know in the comments what story you'd like us to uncover next.